You've entered BOOKSTORM with Kristen Civiletto and me, Chris Storm. This is a podcast devoted to best-selling books that matter, books that make a difference. We're diving down deep with beloved authors about their stories. We're exposing hot-button topics and heartfelt themes, the issues that affect each of us in our own lives, as siblings, parents, partners, friends, as human beings. We're braving new ideas, fresh thoughts, hard lessons, and important truths. Those kinds of things that stay with us long after we turn the last page and close the book. Welcome back to BOOKSTORM Podcast, book lovers, and we're excited to announce BOOKSTORM is now being listened to. Loyal listeners, 61 countries, 45 out of 50 states, and 1,051 cities because of gifted authors like Stephen James, who we have with us today. And for you who are watching on YouTube, we've got this new release, The Broker of Lies. Just devoured it. Stephen, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. I appreciate the chance to be here. Share a little bit about the book.
A lot of it about the book. We can't wait. We're not going to give any spoilers, but we can't wait to dive down deep. So let me tell our listeners a little bit about you, because you've got a lot of followers yourself, but maybe they don't know some of your accomplishments, well earned, and a little bit about your personal history. Well, Stephen is the critically acclaimed author of 18 novels, numerous nonfiction books that have sold over 1 million copies. Wow. He's won so many national and international awards. He's appeared in more than 80 different publications, including the New York Times. He's a popular keynote speaker. Kristen and I have both heard him speaking on writing workshops. He's a professional storyteller with a master's degree in storytelling. He has appeared more than 2,000 times at events spanning the globe. He presents stories and teaching principles of storytelling to writers, speakers, teachers, and leaders. You can also find him, which I do from time to time, very interesting, his weekly podcast called The Story Blender, where storytellers share the secrets of great storytelling. He also was just recently inducted into the Christie Award Hall of Fame for excellence in fiction writing. Very well deserved. Publishers Weekly has called him a master storyteller at the peak of his game. Yes, BOOKSTORM Podcast agrees. And when he's not writing or speaking, you may find him playing basketball, disc golf, hiking near his home in Appalachian Highlands of East Tennessee, or maybe watching too many science fiction movies and eating bottomless bowls of chips. But we just interviewed Tosca Lee about 2 hours ago, who said you also are a big fan of bone marrow now.
Oh, no. Tosca and her bone marrow. We went out for dinner and she's like, yeah, I was really excited about this restaurant because they serve bone marrow. I'm like, what are you talking about? She's like, yeah, it's like meat jello. You'll love it. I'm like, don't even say meat jello. That doesn't make me want to love it. So it was funny, but I tried bone marrow, meat jello. I ate some, but I wouldn't say I'm. Tosca still is the expert on bone marrow eating. Yeah.
Well, we love talking to her too, and we know you're longtime friends, and we just appreciate both of you here on BOOKSTORM. But we're super excited to have you with us today, Stephen.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Well, Stephen, we're here to talk about Broker of Lies. We loved this book. It kept us turning the pages all night. I'm just going to give a summary of the book without any spoilers. And if you want to add anything at the end, of course, we love when you do that. Now, in our story, Travis Brock, he is the man who knows all of our secrets, and he has a secret of his own. Travis is a high-level Pentagon redactor. Basically, he takes classified information out of documents before those are provided to the public after somebody makes a FOIA request or a FOIL request, depending on where you are. He has an eidetic memory, meaning he knows those secrets and he retains them and he can remember them and recall them when he needs to. He finds a clue that potentially may solve a tragic arson that took his wife from him. And finding the truth becomes a huge focus of his life. In fact, he begins to potentially risk everything he has worked for over the years. Now, there's a terror attack looming on the horizon, and a pair of assassins are on his trail. He drops off the grid and he joins forces with a Homeland Security operative who's also in some hot water and potentially some difficult shoes. Together, they race to stop this attack before Brock is neutralized by the people he trusts most.
Hmm.
Would you like to add anything?
No, it sounds so interesting. You know, I wish I would have read that book, but what really got me interested in this whole idea was I wanted to write like a spy espionage kind of story without the normal cast of characters, without CIA agents or FBI or Secret Service or whoever it is that or Homeland that we've heard about and seen before. So I was like, is there anyone that would know our secrets, maybe not be equipped to handle sort of challenges in the field? And I just thought, you know, what about this guy who's literally sitting in the basement of the Pentagon reviewing top secret files for his life? He knows all our secrets. And I'm like, that's too fun and interesting. So that's where I started, and the rest of the story emerged. You probably remember I write organically, so I don't plot anything out or outline anything beforehand. And so it's pretty interesting and fascinating to watch where the story went as I tried to follow him in kind of these adventures.
I love it. It was fresh. It was exciting. And Chris, why don't you go ahead and kick us off? We'll brave the storm.
I really loved it. In fact, I did say to Kristen before you logged on today, I said, yeah, I remember taking your writing class. And there were two things I remember distinctly. Organic writing, you let the characters take on a life and personality of their own. You can feel it through the story. The other thing you said is the action has to always move forward. There has to be what is the least likely thing that you could think might happen next and make that happen. And this book is no exception. I loved it. I couldn't turn the pages fast enough. I want the sequel. Please hurry. Well, let's talk about
it's being finished editing right now. So
I knew it.
It's in the works. It's coming.
Okay, because I can't give any spoilers, but when you close this book, you want more. You got to have more. I want to talk about this concept of justice versus revenge. I loved this quote that we can all relate to, even in the real world. Vengeance is personal, and it always opens more wounds than it heals. Justice is universal. And as your plot unfolded and these people, the characters' true motives began to be revealed, we saw that people in power, even governments, were acting in the name of justice, but really were making it personal. It's kind of hard not to do, I think. When does justice become vengeance and the initial cause become lost in a quest for revenge?
Well, that's a good question. But no, this is actually what you've pinpointed is really what Travis struggles with all throughout the story is he feels like there wasn't justice to the person who started the arson fire at his home when he was so badly burned and lost his wife. And so he was like, I want justice. And to him, that means basically revenge on the people who've done this. And so, as I explored, throughout writing the book over the course of the year or so that I wrote the book, I was just asking that question constantly, like, is there a line between justice and revenge? Whose job is it? Let's say that there's an injustice you see happening right in front of you and no one's doing anything. There's no police or whatever. Is it your job to take justice into your own hands? And when is that acceptable and when is it not? And so all of these questions were interesting, intriguing to me, and sort of drove the story forward. You probably know that I don't start my books with an answer. I always start with a dilemma or a question. And so I wasn't trying to write to make a point or to share an insight that I'd gained. I was instead trying to say, like, here's this character, here's his struggle. Let's see where it leads him. Let's see what insights, he comes to, by the end of the story. So for me, tension lies at the heart of all great stories. If I start a story with the answer, then the tension's gone. Then people are like, oh, I get it. This is a story about why you should follow your heart or why you should be a good friend or whatever it might be. But I don't like to do that. I always like, I want to dive deep into these questions. Like, that's a good question. Like, I don't know the answer exactly. I want to think about it. And so, so that's really my approach. And there aren't easy answers to a lot of these questions, but Travis does come to some conclusions by the end of the story.
He does. And you make the reader think about some issues that maybe we hadn't thought of before. You couldn't help. There was the reverse flip side of this is that Brock defined injustice. He said, you can substitute the word oppression for injustice and you'll be on the right track. Oppression by those who have more power over those who have less, the forcing of one's will upon another to his or her detriment. And I never thought of it that way. It is oppression.
I kind of thought I knew what justice was when I started writing this book. I was like, well, justice is like when the law has its way, or I don't know, whatever I would have defined it as exactly. But I read a lot of stuff on justice and injustice and what it really is and what it means. And this idea kept coming up, and that is the oppression of one class or group of people to their detriment by those in a certain in a power position or so on like that. And it really opened my eyes up, and just this idea that, well, I'm a Christian, and one of the things is like this idea that God's a God of justice, and so like it makes him angry. Injustice makes him angry. The oppression of those who are suffering unjustly. And so for me, it was really interesting to start to understand this idea of oppression being very closely tied to injustice, something I hadn't thought of before, but really kind of opened my eyes up to what justice really is all about.
Mm-hmm. It was eye-opening to the reader too, because in order for injustice to take place, there has to be someone oppressing someone else. Mm-hmm. It was an interesting walk that we took with the character. Thanks. It was great.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
I'd like to look at a different angle. There are people who believe we focus too much on security as a nation. And then there's others like Senator Richardson in your story who believe that we're not paying enough attention. They believe that we must stay 2 steps ahead of our enemies, in terms of both power and technical capability, that maybe we have areas of vulnerability like some of your players did. Do you think that our elected officials have to balance a desire to avoid fear-mongering and scaring all of us against the reality of threats to our nation? And is that something the average person can appreciate?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Anytime that you have this idea of personal freedom and community safety or whatever, like where do you draw the line? Like, let's say I'm going to fly to a conference. And so I go to the airport. Well, I might say I want personal freedom. Like I don't want to take my shoes off and have them, put them through the X-ray machine or whatever. But for the security, our government has decided that these are important security measures to have to be taken. And so anytime that you have the general security meeting up with personal rights and responsibilities, there's always going to be a clash. And again, for fiction to occur, you want clash. You want a lot of clash. And so, in this book, Broker of Lies, there is someone who, really believes that we are vulnerable for certain reasons having to do with our supply chain. And it was fascinating. Just about a few months before the book came out, I remember hearing President Biden talk about supply chain vulnerabilities. I'm like, that's exactly what my book deals with. So, but it's actually a really big kind of concern. So let's say that you have a microchip and it's developed overseas at a country that may not be as friendly to the United States as we would want. So if it's produced over there, could someone put, like, let's say a little virus or bug in it or something, so when it comes back, we put it into, say, a nuclear power station or whatever. Could it infect it? Well, actually, yes, it could, and it does, and that's happened. And so, in the book, of course, there's this senator who's like willing to take any steps necessary to stop that from happening, and he goes kind of off into a direction that you wouldn't exactly expect, but it does make sense within the book. to try and protect our country on a national level. So on those questions, privacy, security, communities' needs versus the individual's needs, all of those things kind of wrap up in that storyline that you were just mentioning.
Yeah. I think the weight of knowledge on certain politicians and high-level bureaucrats must weigh very heavily.
Yeah, I mean, and Travis Brock, he probably carries the most of the burden because he knows
That's right.
even more secrets than the president does. And so just became a fascinating character. And of course, I was interested in learning as much as I could to research the book and make it authentic. I toured the Pentagon a couple of times and met with different officials in the government, scientists and military professionals and so on. And to try and bring that air of authenticity to the story, but there's a huge responsibility, and we should be very thankful for all of those who are out there trying to protect the freedoms that we actually do have.
Agreed.
Oh,
Yeah.
we completely agree. And in
Yeah.
this, I'm going to say the story is extremely authentic. And I could tell that you had done some deep research. We learned a lot about our government, and Travis Brock's job and everything that he did was amazing to me. And realizing that someone is actually doing that, the whole thing was fascinating and intriguing. And I want to go a little deeper on this theme, maybe a message, maybe a lesson that I found as the reader within this novel. It made me think long and hard. Can a wrong make everything right? Can one evil act ignite an onset of good? Okay, let's take it one step further. Doesn't almost like that's not enough. Doesn't almost all wrongdoing try to excuse itself as being just? So in your story for our listeners, you showed us the fragility of the world's quest for uranium. It was being used for good, for power, for evil, for nuclear weapons. Evil and good mixed together. Let's talk about Adira referenced the Manhattan Project. For our listeners, it was the dropping of the first atomic bomb that killed innocent people, but supposedly ignited the ending to a war. Here we are again, good and evil. As the writer of this important story, could you expand it all on this moral dilemma, using evil to obtain a greater good?
Just about all despots throughout history have appealed to the greater good. I'll put it in quotation marks, the greater good, in their tyranny. They'll say, well, I'm making this choice, I'm doing this, and what we would look at it as like a horrific choice, people dying, maybe millions people being killed or oppressed. And they'll say, well, it's for the greater good in the end. And so the idea that the ends can justify the means is a very dangerous idea, I believe. And so there are different theories about what is a good act. Some people say, well, a good act is one that produces a good result. Other people will say, well, a good act is good in itself, like regardless of what it does. So in the first perspective, they would say, well, if this produces a good result, then it's good. And so, for instance, they might say, this person might commit a crime in the future, so we're going to execute them so that therefore all of their future victims will be safe. So that would be a way of justifying the first, is saying more people the greater good will be done if we execute this person, even though he hasn't done the crime, but that would have this good effect. Those with the other view would say, this act is either good in itself or evil within itself. And so which is it? These are interesting questions, I feel like, and worth addressing within stories. And so, Travis Brock has to sort of wrestle through some of this. And I personally feel that the first perspective is often used to justify what is wrong in the moment. And so I don't feel like we should have to do that. Like I do believe that something is right or wrong on its own. And that if you do an evil act and you say you have a good reason for it in the end, that doesn't, to me, justify the evil at the beginning. So that's my kind of perspective on it. But I'm not an ethicist. I'm not a philosopher, but I do find all of these questions super intriguing. And especially when I'm writing about good and evil, about justice, injustice, vengeance, all these kind of things, it's worth exploring and kind of diving into.
And for the reader, you've woven these questions and even an interior moral debate in the mind of the reader as we walk with Travis throughout this book, where we see what he's up against, his decisions, what to do and what not to do, what to stop and what not. And we can't help but feel it too. I think that's what makes for great fiction is, like you said, this constant turmoil going on here. And we're even trying to figure it out with the protagonist. We're with them right along the way.
I feel like great fiction asks big questions. So I always do try to ask big questions in my stories. And I'm not saying they're great fiction. Hopefully they are.
Yes, they are. Yes,
but I mean, that's
Stephen.
what I'm trying to ask, big questions. But of course, this is a thriller. It's not a philosophical, debate or anything. But so it's certainly a suspenseful story, and it has actions and thrills in this. But it's kind of like there are these undercurrents of philosophical questioning, moral, not ambiguity, but I would say moral complexity that kind of weave through it and hopefully give it a deeper texture to the story.
Oh yeah. For our listeners, this book is also just good plain fun, watching what he goes through and all the hurdles he has to encounter and everything that happens. And Kristen and I, like we always say, boy, we'd love to go into more details, but we don't want to spoil it for the reader. It's just intriguing. Definitely.
Yeah, you took, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say one of the most fun aspects of the story was really this character Gunnar Bane, who's sort of former military, super tough as nails kind of guy. He's really gritty and everything, but he's trying to write a romance novel to actually raise some money to send his niece to college. So, but he's really bad at romance. Like he's terrible, but he thinks he's kind of good. And so like, I was just thinking of one of the scenes where he says something like, Donovan reached out and stroked Jessica's arm, touching her skin, the largest and most visible organ on her body. And you're just like, it's so bad, like this so terrible. The largest and most visible organ on her body, but you're just like, oh no, this is terrible. But he's like, this is pretty good or whatever. So it ended up being tons of fun to write his character, this contrast between how tough he is, in real life, but he's trying to write these scenes and he's not so good at it.
It was hysterical. I laughed so hard. Kristen, you showed your son some of those scenes. You're like, this is hysterical. And what I want to say one more thing about that. Is this a writing trick? This juxtaposition between getting us to laugh, and then the next minute we're on such a high of laughter that we get so serious and almost a little more angry or a little sadder.
I actually do like for there to be light moments in my stories. And if a story is just too heavy all the time, it can wear us out, just like anything in life. If it's super intense, suspenseful from start to finish, it's like, wears us out. So having sort of these beats and moments, the pace of the story, so that there are, obviously tense scenes and then something lighthearted. And I feel like it gives readers a little bit of a break to be able to go back to the more suspenseful sections like that. So I do try to do that on purpose.
Stephen, you made utilitarianism fun and thrilling and exciting. I think Jeremy Bentham would be very proud.
Oh my goodness. You have studied philosophy, I think.
Yes, he would. So one of your characters says, intimacy is when people take off all of their masks and not necessarily all of their clothes. Now, this is such a great line for many reasons, but particularly in a story and context where nobody is sure who to trust. Now, in your story, the government itself as a body cannot trust or distrust the players. It comes down to people and judgments. Is that one way in which we as a nation will always be vulnerable because there's the people factor?
Well, It's interesting these days. People tend to, okay, so let's say that someone appears to be judgmental. Very often there's a big negative sort of backlash to that. Like, we don't want people to seem judgmental. But on the other hand, it's like judging them for being judgmental is judgmental. And it's like, wait a minute, what's going on? But people are very sensitive these days to this idea of being judged and having things judged against them. And so with obviously politics can be divisive and all of these things. So I guess, when I look at it, I want my stories to ask interesting questions, to allow people to maybe step back and see points of view, maybe from a different perspective that they hadn't thought of before. And as I've been blabbering, I completely forgot your question. So I'll just keep talking as if I know what
Vulnerability.
I'm talking about. Okay,
And because if
I knew
people
that's
know, you
something
were
he was
getting there.
judging. I was like, I have no idea what it was about.
No, you were getting there because
Yeah, well, probably not, but
well, but your characters individually, but us as a nation, I
mm,
think there is that vulnerability because we have emotions. We
yeah.
have these thought processes that go in directions that you can't always predict. And that's what I really loved about this character because he had one big vulnerability, which I'm not going to say because I don't want to have a spoiler here. But he really prided himself on not being the person who could be bought off or vulnerable until something comes along that challenges that.
I think that vulnerability makes characters interesting and relatable. And there's a difference between vulnerability and weakness. Like weakness, well, let me say this: like if you love someone, you're vulnerable, but love is not a weakness. So if you love someone very deeply, you're vulnerable. Why? Because if you can harm me by harming the person that I love. And so I'm always looking for ways to try and make my characters vulnerable, but not fragile. Like I want them to be real in that sense. So I look for three things: admirable, but not perfect, vulnerable, but not fragile, and unforgettable, but not annoying. So those are the things I'm trying with my main characters. I'm so, okay, how is this character vulnerable, admirable, and unforgettable? And if they're not, like for instance, Gunnar Bane earlier, he was, when I first started writing, he was just kind of this tough kind of guy, like this military guy, but he's sort of one-dimensional. Like he wasn't super interesting, I feel like. But then by adding this other sort of dimension to him, he became someone super fascinating, and we kind of like him more. And so vulnerability ends up being vital for me in kind of developing characters that I feel like we can relate to.
Excellent.
Yeah.
It's like people in the real world. I always say
Yeah.
we don't, the people that we follow the most, whether it's actresses or politicians or sports figures, we don't want someone perfect. We really love the people who've gone through some stuff and can say, hey, I made it out, or that are quirky or different, or give really crazy, ridiculous romance stories like Gunnar. And then we just, we just loved them. I just want to say again for our listeners, you've got to pick this book up. You're going to love it. Broker of Lies by Stephen James. It's deep. Here, we're Bookstorm podcast, so we like to do a deep dive. But this book has some deep moral issues that are going to make you think. It's also a thriller, and there's twists and turns, and there's a mystery to uncover, and there's hidden doors and red herrings and bunny trails, and it's for a sleuth detective. This is for the smart reader, a book like this. And that's why we love it so much. And before we let you go, what are you working on? So you finished the sequel. It's done, almost ready.
Yeah, it's pretty much all together. I worked very hard on it the last couple of months, and so we're just going through some proofreading for it now, and looking at maybe doing a third in the series. I'm not sure, so I'm kind of in the place of breathing because I mostly finished up the second book in the series, and regrouping. So those are two good things that I don't do enough of: breathing and regrouping. So I'm trying to do them both right now. And but I appreciate all the kind words, for Broker of Lies. And it was it took me about usually I do about a book a year, but this took me almost 2 years, I guess, to do all the research, all the writing, revising. editing and so on. So it was a labor of love, and I'm glad that it's out there. And I don't know if you knew this, but when I was writing it, my goal was to make the final reveal in the last word of the book. And I didn't quite do that, like it's the second to last sentence of the book, but that was like my goal. Like I was like, that would be so interesting if like the very last word was a final reveal. And as it turned out, it wasn't quite the very last word, but that was super interesting and tough to do, to write a story where you're like, okay, the last page has this reveal. Now it needs to fit throughout the whole story. So, but it was fun to do, and I hope people will enjoy it.
I loved it. So I suspected it. I suspected that ending,
Yeah.
but then there were other things thrown in, and I'm saying to myself, no, that's not it. Now it's no. And then at the very end, when I read that thing, I said right out loud, what? Oh my
Oh, that's good.
I just loved it so much. So listeners, you're going to want to connect with Stephen James in the meantime. Maybe you want to even take one of his writing classes. You can find him on stephenjames.net. You can follow him on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. I see you're going to the Realm Makers Writing Conference in July.
I'll be there. Yeah, sure.
Then you're doing a fusion storytelling workshop in July.
I think I am actually.
Well, yes, you are. And ask Rachel. She's behind you. She'll vouch for me.
Oh my goodness.
And did you just get back from Thriller Fest?
Just got back from an event called Thriller Fest. It's for suspense and authors and thriller writers and so on. And this fall, I'm actually planning in Tennessee a 3-day writing intensive. So if people are interested in all in that, you're welcome to email us. We'll send you info as soon as we have it. But that'll be an in-person event here in the beautiful eastern part of Tennessee. So info@stephenjames.net. You can email us and we'll send you whatever you need to. But thanks for having me on the show. I really enjoyed the opportunity and look forward to touching base again with you all sometime in the future.
Next year when the
Absolutely.
book comes out.
There you
Now,
go. All right, that'll be perfect.
Second visit. We're thrilled to have you, and we're excited for what you're doing. And of course, we're big fans, and great talking to you again.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
It's always good to see Stephen James again. It's like an old friend. Once you're on the show 2 times, and now we're heading into 3 times, we love to see our favorite authors back again. And this was just a book with a lot of food for thought in the midst of a great mystery and a thrill ride. Here's something else that hit me that was a quote in the book. It said, does justice really lead to peace? Maybe to a certain extent, but these are 2 entirely different concepts. What's your thought on that? Any more thought on that? Does justice really lead to peace?
Yeah, I think in some respects it does, because first of all, when there's justice, a public wrong has been righted. When somebody is tried and convicted and sent to prison for a wrong that was public, there's a certain sense of, okay, I don't have to take justice into my own hands. There has been some measure of justice done. It stops people from being a vigilante or getting revenge. Because first of all, revenge never ends, right? Because there's revenge. It's like the Hatfields and McCoys. It escalates and it goes back and forth. You don't have peace, but you do have peace when people feel that there has been a sense of justice carried out and meted out.
That's
What do
a
you
good
think?
way. That's a good way to put it, Kristen. And even if you don't have the justice yet, to know that there is a justice system in place that can take the burden of that task on you, even though it's not always perfect. I'm grateful that I'm not responsible to take justice in my own hands all the time. Would be a very big responsibility, but that's an excellent way to put it. Okay, here's another quote, because I love these quotes. I had so many.
I know, I got one too.
Adira's grandmother says, the question isn't whether or not life is fair, but what we're going to do about it in the meantime while we search for answers. And that hit me strong. I'm like, you can sit back and be miserable, and you can say life isn't fair, and you can dig a hole in the ground and refuse to move or grow or start something new or look at something different because you won't get over that one hurdle that you can't get over. And that could stop everything else in your life.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought that was a cool thing for a grandmother to say, although we know it really was Stephen James saying it. But it's not whether or not life is fair. What are you going to do about it in the meantime? That's a cool
Yeah.
quote. What
Well,
did
it's
you
one
have?
of the things over which you have some control is how you view something or respond or react to something. But there was another issue that I thought was really interesting to discuss, and that was this quote from Adira. What was the greater slaughter? 85 million people during World War II or dropping the bomb?
Mhm.
And
That's a
this
tough one.
is a
That's a
tough
tough
one.
one. That's like one of my questions to Stephen is any evil capable of bringing about good? And this is a question I don't have an answer for. I don't think he did really either. He said, I don't believe that any evil could be good. I want to believe that too. I think evil is evil is evil. So, okay, you get done with that sentence that you just said. Yes, you saved a lot of lives, but let's take a step back. Yes, you killed a lot of people.
Yeah.
That's a
But look
tough
at
one.
it is tough because look at the example he gave us. You know, if we hang and take out of the equation a future serial murderer, we just saved all those people. And isn't that a good result? And again, we may think these are esoteric ethics discussions and philosophical discussions, except they're not, because it goes to the root of what you believe is important in terms of justice and our justice system. And I think every one of us, as adults at least functioning in this world, we need to press in and know why we believe what we believe. Because it's very easy to toss it out and say, of course, we should kill that person who's going to be a future serial murderer. Okay. But it was a wrong act to execute them beforehand,
Yeah.
right?
And
So
how about all the things in this world that are used for evil and for good? Okay, like uranium, like
yes,
drugs, like weapons.
yes,
I mean, this is a very you're going to get people on both sides, and I'm not here to take up any side or the other. I'm really not, because listen, I wish I had all the answers, but I don't. I think situational, every situation is different, but there are a lot of things that are presented into this world that can be used for horrific evil, but also good. Wow. That
yeah.
hit me in this story. I'm like, you touched upon something very meaningful and thoughtful here.
Well, and I think what you brought up was excellent because those are morally neutral things that can be used by immoral people or by moral people. But does that mean we eliminate them entirely? Like money. Money is morally neutral, right? But how people use money may not be or maybe. And
You could
I just,
we
there's
could
so
go
much
into
to
this.
dive in.
This
Yeah.
is a cool topic that people will, I'm sure they're going to log off here and keep thinking about the things that are used for both. There's a lot of them. And yeah,
Yes.
you're right. Do we stop making them? Because if we do, we don't reap the benefits of these things. But it's just a cool thing. I just love this character in the book too. I mean, I loved walking behind him the whole way. I'm super glad there's a sequel coming. Now, readers, I don't want you to pull this up and look at the last page because Stephen, we were all talking about that. Don't do it to yourself. Save it for the end because it's too good. And we're thrilled that you joined us today. We're in so many places, literally all around the world. Grateful. And I'm going to leave you with a few storm predictions because summer is approaching here. And we've had a lot of advanced readers' copies. A pleasure reading these books before they come out. But we're bringing to you Madeline Martin, The Keeper of Hidden Books, Katie Quinn and Janie Chang, The Phoenix Crown, Matthew Quirk, Inside Threat, Marie Benedict and Victoria Christopher Murray with The First Ladies, our friend Viola Shipman, Famous in a Small Town, Ashley Audrin and The Whispers, Fiona Davis, Spectacular, Sandra Brown, Out of Nowhere, and our new friend, Tiffany Hammond, who we love, with a very wonderful children's book, A Day with No Words.
It's wonderful. And listeners, as Chris mentioned, we are growing, growing, growing. We thank you. We are so grateful that you share our socials. We love having these kinds of discussions where it makes us think. It makes us press in on what we believe. And of course, with these authors and the wonderful things they come up with to put us in these difficult situations, we love talking about those too. So we want you to stay on our radar. You can find us at bookstormpodcast.com. You can find us at Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, and of course, YouTube, where you can see our authors. Search for Bookstorm Podcast, and we should come right up. Until next time, one of the best ways to brave the storm is to dive down deep into life-changing fiction.